tonight we have myself, I'm Stephanie Chewning, and we also have Jazz Watts, who is our Justice Strategist with 100 Miles, and we'll be sharing a little bit more of an insight to Sapelo as we do this together.
Yeah, so just want to thank everyone for coming out to this talk, which we've done a few times before. It's been a
minute.
It's been a little while, but I'm glad to be here. As Stephanie was saying, I'm a justice strategist with OHM. I'm also from the island, from Sapelo, so I look forward to us talking about the island this evening. Before we get started, though, what I would like to do is, as you all know, on October 19th, 2024, there was a terrible tragedy, a gangway collapse that happened after our Cultural Day Festival. And 7 people lost their lives. Many people were, injured. Grateful for so many people in the community and others that were on the island at the time that were first responders. So I wanted to just take a few moments, if you all would just stand up for a few moments, if you don't mind. And I'd like to read out the names of those people that passed, and then just have a few moments of silence for them. Jacqueline Carter Cruz, Cynthia Gibbs, Charles McIntosh, William Johnson Jr., Ms. Carlotta McIntosh, Isaiah Thomas, and Queen Welch. And we just want to take a few moments to just honor them and to remember them. Thank you for that.
So just to orientate everyone to where we're talking about, I am sure you are all experts already. Sapelo is 60 miles south of where we're standing right now. It is the 4th largest barrier island on the Georgia coast of the 14 major barrier islands that we consider. And a barrier island, I'm going to go very basic, are these islands that sit in front of our coast. They're made of sand. They're constantly moving and reshaping along our coastline. And they're here to help protect from storms and weather events. Sapelo, also you can see sort of in the satellite image, there is a river going here. So this land is actually a separate island. This is Blackbeard, which is part of our national refuge system. And then Sapelo itself extends all the way back here. So you can see it's nice little length of that. It kind of fits almost central, a little further south in that. I got this ready for you, Jazz, and I realized you're not going to flip them. So we're going to talk history, so we have to go back to the very beginning of the human influence of the island. So humans have been recorded through artifacts dating back more than 4,500 years ago. So a very long time ago. Out there so long ago, we don't actually have names for the cultures that are there because of that. But in the more recent times, you would have had the Wali and the Creek Indians out there. These are the indigenous people that would have interacted with the early European explorers. So especially with the monks, the Spanish monks that came over there. These images I show are like the ones you see in every textbook talking about this time period. So these are obviously from a European perspective of that, but for some reason this image of them shoving a pole or a tree down an alligator's mouth always is quite intriguing to me. On Sapelo itself, there are burial mounds that come from the Wali and Creek times, but there are also evidence of shell rings or shell mounds that are also found on Sapelo. And these are the earliest evidence of humans in North America. And this is obviously a professor's rendition. This is a picture, sorry it's a little blurry, of a shell ring that was cut into to do, when they were trying to see the different layers of it by a professor. So again, this is all theory. There are 3 major shell rings on Sapelo, and the theories of them is because one of them is so much larger that it was probably used as a home site, that these peoples actually stayed there all the time and used the resources around them. Obviously, they were eating all the abundant seafood that's found in all of our marshes and estuaries along our coast. And where the smaller ones, from some of the artifacts, they think that they would have been used for religious or festivals of religious rites kind of things that were found along there. There's a lot we don't know, but these shell rings are found along the coast all the way to Mississippi. And so, but it's really unique to have such an old artifact, because this predates the pyramids, to put it in a time, right? So, and this is just here, and most of it is overgrown now. Like and it's on the north end of the island where most visitors don't go unless you're with a tour. So most people haven't even know it's even there, or they could drive right by it and not know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the other shell mounds have been, just like other coastal communities, they're missing now because the shell was then used to make tabby. And as Savannahans, you all have to know what tabby is. But for our viewers online, tabby is a concrete material that is a mixture of sand, water, broken oyster shells, and lime, which is burnt oyster shells, that make a very strong material. Well, or it'll come up again. So the Spanish missionaries, those are the dates they were there, came in the late 1500s, set up monasteries, and just like all the other islands in the southeast, they came in to convert the indigenous people to their religion, and some of them went better than others. On Sapelo, for a long time, they did pretty well. Obviously, they were here for almost over 100 years. But then there were revolts on that. So this is, they think they have found where, this is them doing ground penetrating radar to actually find that location. I think they have a good idea, but it's not exactly known exactly where the Spanish missions were. However, you can see where the term Sapelo came from. So it was the indigenous people's mispronunciation of Zapala. Is that how you would say it, Jess?
Yeah.
Zapala, and so Sapelo came from the priest that was there on Sapelo. So when James Oglethorpe, as Savannahans again, know that came to start the colony of Georgia in 1733, he used the services of Mary Musgrove, who was half British and half indigenous. And as a guide as well as an interpreter, as he went and traveled the Georgia coast in the colonies as he did on his trips. And as part of her reward, she was gifted Sapelo as land. So we had a female landowner right in the beginning. Unfortunately, the king sold it out of her, and she went back to England and fought for it in court. So I think she ended up losing it in the end because she was given St. Catherine's, Ocelot, and Sapelo.
And I'll just add too, is I think that, as Stephanie had mentioned earlier, just talking about just kind of this European prism and perspective. This idea that, someone can quote unquote, own these spaces and land and, make decisions on spaces where human beings already were, or existed. And we'll start getting into talking about the history of, enslavement as captured Africans were brought to Sapelo as early as the 1700s. So I think in the next few slides we'll talk about that. And so this is chocolate plantation that is on the north end, of the island. These are the ruins from one of the cabins, or a kitchen. And this was a creek barn that was built up maybe in the 20s. I'm not sure, but when we talk about, or we think about the history, you know, of spaces like, you know, Sapelo, there's always kind of this, you know, story about, you know, enslavement and what it was like for, you know, enslaved Africans and people who were brought here. You know, when you read historical books about Spalding, you'll hear this term of like a nice, you know, slave owner. I always tell people there's no such thing. It doesn't exist. You know, I always think about the fact that, you know, my ancestors were there in this space, in this foreign land, and could look right out into the sound, but had no way really to, you know, get back home. You know, we're talking about an institution in which songs were written about people who were worked to death and literally died in fields. You know, a lot of the, you know, the ditch system and, you know, the clearing of land was done by enslaved and human labor. You know, people constantly died from, you know, rattlesnake bites and just all of these things, and dealing with the wilderness, dealing with sickness. You know, the inhumanity of such an institution is something that, you know, I just cannot emphasize enough. As we learn about, you know, the history and talk about all of the beauty of the island too, we always have to remember, you know, the dark history that is connected to it. And that history does belong to all of us. So, but you may want to talk about it a little bit.
Thank you, Jess. So Patrick McKay was the first white landowner, and chocolate was where he first started his plantations. So this area actually changed hands quite a lot. There was a French settlement that also landed on it. So the age of these buildings actually varies because they were built by different groups of people. And Jazz already kind of pointed out that this is a remnants of a slave cabin. This was a drying barn that they dried tobacco was actually tried to grow out here. This building was redone in the 1930s. That's why it looks so good. But again, all tabby structures on there. And this was an ideal location because you can see right behind this picture how close it is to the water. And so this is opening up on the Sapelo Sound and easy access to shipping because that's how they traveled. It was all waterways at that point on there. And the name is again, mispronunciation. There's no chocolate that was ever grown on Sapelo. That's the first question always. It would have been, they had cattle and then later on cotton. They would have tried lots of other things like indigo and citrus that was done similar to other islands.
And I'll add too, is that if you ever go to the island, I don't know how many people have been there, but there is a sign that kind of gives this short synopsis of the space, and it talks about these French enslavers, and the words that are missing are enslavers. It doesn't say that, You see everything but that in that language. And I think that's a part of this lesson too, is how is history being documented or has been documented and has been told. And that also needs to change. There also needs to be a realization. Throughout, even the South, you'll see, historical documents that talk about Thomas Spalding, and they talk about being an agriculturalist and all of these different things, but he was an enslaver. That's who these people were. They can be all those things too, but they did not till the soil, they did not do the work, they did not grow these things. That was done by human labor in brutal fashion. So.
Well, the most largest plantation owner was Thomas Spalding. He bought land on Sapelo in 1802. And besides being the largest cotton grower on Sapelo, he also, with the enslaved peoples, redid the ecology or how the water moved on the island. Jazz mentioned about ditch building. Most of the middle of Sapelo at that time would be really swampy and marshy. It was not ideal for planting as they clear cut the island. And so there's actually a ditch that was built along the whole center of the island to drain the water to make it better for cotton growing. Thomas Spalding was friends with John Cooper, who owned Cannon's Point on St. Simon's Island, so not very, I mean, their plantations looked at each other, and they worked together, creating Sea Island cotton to what it became during that time through breeding programs, making it one of the best cottons. It's a long staple cotton, so they could get higher value from that cotton sold. It was used for linens and laces, so it got them a lot more money. Thomas Spalding also dabbled in others. He did try growing indigo and others, but he found great success in sugarcane, which was grown out there. And this is actually a picture of his sugarcane mill that he had there to help process it. The reason he became as wealthy as he did is because the War of 1812 had happened, and an embargo was put on all sugar coming from the Caribbean because it was British. And so his sugar then became high in demand, and as we all know in economics, he could charge much higher wages for it on there.
Yeah, I'll just add he was, has historically been known as a significant figure. One of the, largest owners of human beings on the island. And, for me, first of all, just thinking about the fact that, this man accumulated an extreme amount of wealth, significant, off of the backs of human beings, the free labor. So when you, read books about him or look up things, again, he's one of those figures where you don't see enslaver, or brutality or inhumanity associated, with them, but you see, the credit, as Stephanie was talking about, for all these crops and agriculture. And I always tell people to think about the other side and the other perspective of this, that, we need to do more, that when we're talking about these things, that we're telling the whole story and not just part of it. I know that in books they talk about how, brilliant, and he did this and he did that, and he didn't do anything. He wasn't out there doing anything. And I think we always just want to keep that in mind, that this was a system that was built to exploit, other human beings. And, you can get into, and we'll talk about it, a whole conversation about, all that wealth passed down, but that wealth did not pass down to the descendants of the people, who were doing all of that work and did all of that labor and literally, built these spaces. So, yeah.
So one of the men that helped make him as successful as he was Bilal Muhammad. He was born in Africa to a higher ranking chieftain. He was obviously kidnapped and enslaved, originally brought to the Bahamas, and then from the Bahamas is where Thomas Spalding bought him as a human and brought him to Sapelo. Because of his upbringing and his experience, he was very well educated from the region of Africa where they're sold, and he knew a lot about growing different crops and knowing the skills of that. So he became kind of in charge, he did become in charge of the other enslaved people there. His legacy is also known is because he was able to write because of his upbringing. So this text here is actually written by him, he was a Muslim. And so this is the oldest Muslim text that was found in the Americas of that. I believe it's now at the University of Georgia's collection.
Yeah. So it's in a special collection.
Yeah.
Library. And so Bilal Muhammad, we believe, was captured in Africa around the time that he was probably a teenager, took to the church in Caicos, and he was enslaved there for about a decade or so. When this man, Thomas Spalding, went and purchased him, he also brought his wife with him, and his daughters. And this, of course, was a manuscript that he wrote, the rememberings of, his religious teaching. So he was an extremely intelligent individual. And when I always think about the story of Bilal, of which I'm also a direct descendant, thinking about people having to do what they had to do in order to survive under this brutal, system that existed, is a extremely difficult thing to think about, to imagine being him. And then the other stories that people don't hear about are, there were enslaved people who tried to escape and leave the island, who were unsuccessful, or who were killed, or who were severely punished. And so those are kind of the things that don't get mentioned, as much. But he is certainly a significant figure, not only when it comes to enslavement, but I think his intelligence. Obviously by having this written manuscript that was passed down, and he spoke, several different languages. I mean, to imagine, having to go from the life of freedom that he had to having to exist under the system, I say is always something that people should think about. And it always reminds me how strong, my ancestors had to be. And those are, I think, the kind of things that, help me, help descendants, not only on Sapelo, but in other places, because we know that our ancestors struggled through a lot. So somebody had to survive in order for me to be here standing in front of you as a part of this conversation.
So at the end of the Civil War, the freed black people were encouraged to come back to the islands, and they were given 40 acres and a mule, according to Sherman's Act. However, that didn't last very long until it was repealed. But in that time, many of the former enslaved on Sapelo did come back, and these freedmen communities started on Sapelo, and they were spread without the island. They weren't all in what we think of today as Hog Hammock. There were other ones. There was Shellman's Bluff, Raccoon Bluff, Lumber Landing. I'm going to forget them all.
Lumber Landing, Mars.
That's what I was
Raccoon Bluff. There were several communities, probably 15 or more communities that were on this island, of freedmen, and we'll get into, kind of the rest of the story. And behavior was also, a settlement. Now, in Sapelo they had something during enslavement which they called the task system, and that was where, each family was given, a certain amount of labor, a certain amount of work that they had to complete. And people think about that and they go, oh, well, slavery wasn't so bad, they were with their families. But when you think about how even, more sinister the institution is, to have people, with their families and to be given, tasks that they had to complete, that if you did not complete, there were severe punishments, that you had to face. So you had, it was a way basically to work people even harder, But I look at and I think about the definition of resilience is the fact that there were, several communities, over 15 communities that still existed after, enslavement. And I think that is a testament to the strength, of the people that survived during enslavement.
So the next major landowner of Sapelo was Howard Coffin. Howard Coffin was originally from Michigan. He worked he was a vice president of the Hudson Motor Company. So this was one of the first auto companies in there. He's known as the father of standardization. So he was the first person that looked at automobiles and was like, oh, let's make parts that fit in more than one model. So instead of making everything unique. So he, there's a joke though that the company was called Hudson Motor Company because no one wanted to drive around in a coffin.
I never thought about that.
So yeah, so he originally came down. This is the age where all of our barrier islands here in Georgia or our northern industrialists were trying to come down for their beautiful winter retreats. And as it was yesterday, we know why, because it was so beautiful here yesterday. Today, not so much. But coming down here, looking for hunting, this recreational sort of life that a lot of us enjoy today. He originally came over to Sapelo on a hunting trip and fell in love with it, and then immediately came in. So he bought his first piece of property in 1912, and by the time he sold in 34, he owned basically all the land except for the freedmen communities on here. He rehabbed what was Spalding's house, and I have a slide with all the houses on it later, but he basically took what Spalding's house and redid it and remodeled it then. This is a picture of his wife, Matilda. He was very much in love with. And he did all these other gardens and projects here. He was able to tap in to the artesian wells and created all of this landscaping here and on the island. He is also the person who bought Sea Island and built the Cloister Hotel. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Sea Island sits in front of St. Simon's. It is a resort island with a gate and known as one of the premier vacation destinations on the coast and in the United States.
Yeah, and what I would add too, and then our next slide, I'm sure we're going to get into Reynolds, R.J. Reynolds Jr. You know, but thinking about the fact that, you know, I tell people that historically you have this kind of, you know, semblance of ownership of land, you know, this space passing down and passing through. But what never changes is the people who are the descendants of the people that were enslaved being at the bottom of the system, right? So the system of enslavement never really truly leaves. It's still there. You know, there is this white infrastructure and system that still owns and controls, you know, the entire space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially with R.J. Reynolds Jr., but, you know, it's like it doesn't necessarily end. There's just a continuation, you know, of the same system that's there. So people have to learn how to be resilient themselves in their own kind of family enclaves, in their circles, and they have to, in a sense, find their own strength. And when we get to Reynolds and talk about employment, like these people, you know, own the space, so therefore they are the employer. So imagine, you know, we'll hear about how all of a sudden these communities just kind of people start getting forced into this one certain part of the island. But if you read it in some other history books, they'll say, oh, well, people moved there. And that's just, you know, not the truth. But.
So in 1934, was after the Great Crash, Howard Coffin actually lost a ton of money and was actually financially strapped. At that time, R.J. Reynolds Jr. had come to visit the island and ended up buying all of Coffin's land ownings on Sapelo, including his boat. And that's when his time on Sapelo began. He is the heir to the Reynolds tobacco fortune. It was his father who made all the money. He did dabble in it, but he was known as a playboy, traveled the world, kind of just had fun. He did, though, join the Navy during World War II. He worked and helped with navigation on the Pacific front of it, and until he died, he had a naval uniform that fit him. Was often photographed in it. He was very proud of that. He was also married 4 times, to one of them twice, because he was actually not divorced when he married her the first time. So he had married 4 times. He had 7 children. His last child with his 4th wife is still alive. And actually his 4th wife only passed away in the last 2 or 3 years, Anne-Marie?
Yeah, it wasn't that long.
Not that long ago where she passed away. There are lots of stories that have been told about him and his, he was very much a party drinker, smoker. He did end up dying of emphysema in the end. And Anne-Marie, his 4th wife, was his nurse.
Yeah, and
No, you can go.
no, and I think, the other side of this too is that, he, this man was all those things, but he was also a continuation of the system. And under kind of his reign of the island is where, many of those communities just slowly disappeared because people were forced into what is now, the last community, really, Hog Hummock. Johnson Hummock is also next to it, but it just doesn't have any full-time residents, a lot of family members that still, that still go there, but people, and when you read about this, like I said before, certain books, they'll just kind of tell you, well, there are these just land swaps, and you have to think to yourself, why would anyone want to swap their land to move to lower land, because the land has lower elevation, to a southern part of the community, when there is a thriving community on Raccoon Bluff and, our Lumber Landing and a lot of these other places. So they were literally, forced, whether it was through hook or crook or pressure, he was the employer, on the island. So, people had to be enterprising. But there were certain things that, that if you have power, you have power. That means if somebody got sick and you needed, and an emergency happened and you needed to get them off the island, guess what? Guess who controlled, going on and off, or getting off quickly if it was an emergency? This person. And so that's when you end up over, this time period, literally, of, all of these communities literally disappearing and everyone being pushed into Hog Hummock, or this one part of the island.
So we're actually backtracking a little here. So if anyone has visited Sapelo, one of the major attractions that people like to see is known as the Reynolds Mansion. But it was also known as the South End House, the Big House over time, because it's all of these men that we just talked about all lived in the same structure. So starting in the top left-hand corner is a rendition of it, a sketch that Spalding's granddaughter did of what his house looked like. It was modeled after Monticello. It was tabby walled. They were 3 foot thick at some areas. Again, helped with heating and cooling during the early 1800s. Also, it was raised up. However, there was quite a large hurricane that devastated Sapelo in the 1800s, and there was 6 feet of water in that house. So quite that. This is actually a picture of what the Sapelo Mansion looked like before a hunting club came in and redid a little bit of it before Howard Coffin came in and remodeled it and updated it to this. He tried to keep a lot of the original architecture to the original, and this is the first model. He actually did more of that because eventually they connected the kitchen. This was originally the kitchen had been separated, they connected it. He added a 3rd floor, which is the ballroom. And because Howard Coffin is from the north, he added a basement. Which to this day still has pumps all the time going because it also always has water in it. And then when Reynolds came in, he took Coffin's house and just fancified it, is like I like to do it. So he brought in a muralist, Metaboni, and he did these very fanciful murals in multiple rooms, including the ballroom. He also added electricity and air conditioning to the house. Every modern convenience. He had the original automatic doors for in and out of the dining room. And then also these actually pools were added during Coffin. Coffin actually built an outdoor and an indoor pool because he loved to swim, and so that. So this is a modern look. So now Reynolds Mansion, and the reason it's called that is he's the last owner, and it was sold to the state from him, which we'll get more into, is now part of the state park system. It's a lodge, and so you can actually rent the whole house. So you and your friends can come and rent. The rent, and it comes with your food and all of that.
And I'll also add too that, thinking about, the hands and the labor that built all of this, because, it was, black hands, my ancestors. And of course there were people, like you said, that were brought in to do sculptures and all these other things, but, I always tell people to think about, what does it mean when we say the word reparations, when we talk about what does it mean to, try to advocate for reparative work, for actual healing, for, systems and policies that, recognize, that several things can be true at the same time, all at once. So you can, kind of have these beautiful, looking things, but at the same time, still have people suffering, in spaces, or without, access to certain resources, or being just simply forced to live under certain limitations, depending on who has the power or who's in charge of these spaces at the time.
So as Coffin came in, he did a cannery. He started a cannery business, fishing for all the oysters were off the coast. And then when R.J. Reynolds came in, he had a huge dairy complex. He liked to dip his toes in lots of different things. But this is what now is University of Georgia's Marine Institute, otherwise known as UGAMI. And it sits right adjacent, the Reynolds Mansion is actually just up in that fourth quarter. So this is now an off-site research institution for the university system. They do have I think they've restarted them again, but they are doing actually like Maymester classes there, so undergrads can come, but also over 100 different other universities send grad and doctoral candidate students here to do work because the abundance of marsh that is surrounding this. It's a great place. But this building was the original dairy barn, and upstairs there is a movie theater that was built by R.J. Reynolds.
And a ton of family members that, retired from the Marine Institute, because when you think about Sapelo, I mean, these are the jobs that are there, that are on the island. Otherwise, people would have to leave, the island. So many of them, retired. I always tell people, and I think we'll go to Eugene Oldham, but when you think about like the research that they historically did in these spaces, I always say that research never would have been fulfilled without the people that were there, because they understood the waterways, they understood, there was a greenhouse there, how to grow things, I mean, all those things. So, I just always try to emphasize too, to not be dismissive of the indigenous knowledge of the descendants of those Africans that also played a role in the success of these institutions.
So Eugene Oldham was a scientist at University of Georgia, and he was studying ecology of the salt marsh. And it was a meeting between him and R.J. Reynolds that then created what we now know as UGAMI, because he was studying the salt marsh also with Dr. Teal. He came to such notoriety because instead of looking at an individual species and how it interacts with the environment, he started to look about how different species interact with different. So that's why he's called the modern, came up with modern ecology and how we look today, and literally wrote the textbook on the subject. So what students are learning today are based on the principles that he was studying on our coast, which is pretty cool and unique that way.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add is that, I think that, I'm not, an academic or a researcher, but I hope that, at some point that more research is done into, the supporting cast, that was there, the community members, that were there, because when these people had to go out to certain places or to learn about certain things or, to understand, distinct things about certain waterways and the sound, it was the people that were there that just knew, these things. They understood it because they had to live it in order to be able to survive. So maybe they didn't know all the scientific terms or didn't call things in that manner, but they definitely understood the economy and ecology of the island.
Institutional knowledge.
Institutional knowledge. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
So that was the beginning of Sapelo turning over to the state of Georgia. After R.J. Reynolds Jr. died, his fourth wife, Anne Marie, started to sell off parts of the island. And so the map is showing you, so the first big, so Ugambi was already UGA before that, but the north end, which is now a wildlife management area for the state, was first on Chewning in 1969. That was first sold to the state, so that is now run by DNR Wildlife Management. And that area is really managed for hunting, fishing, and the animals. And then in 1976, we have the selling of the south end of the island, and then the creation soon after of the Sapelo Island National Estuary Research Reserve, which we now know as SINER. Sorry, all my acronyms, need to get them right, as SINER. But the exception to that was now hog hammock.
Right, and as I was mentioning earlier, this is the part of the island where, people were literally, pushed into. And I think that if you can imagine, when we're talking about all these spaces, I mean, there were communities, that were there. And I mean, right now, there are active cases with descendants who are fighting, for claims on land that, their ancestors lived on. So when these two big transfers happened and they went to the state, there was always, and I don't know if people know what heirs property is, but heirs property is basically, you have multiple, co-owners, of property. There's a good bit of heirs property that's on Sapelo, and you have, parts of the island where literally descendants are co-owners beside the state, which should not be happening. But what it does is it dictates that these transactions that happen weren't done legally, a lot of them. And that's why you have, all of this confusion, all this fractured title. But it also comes from people being forced to leave their land, right? I worked at a place for a few years that specifically looked at, heirs property, it looked at title, went through probate. And the one thing that I found that was just incredible was, usually you find periods of time that were just dominated by certain people, our attorneys, that were the authors of documents, and you see a mark by someone, or sometimes you see a perfect signature, but back then, and we're talking about McIntosh County where the courthouse burned down twice, and it happens to be in rooms where deeds were. And so, if someone has a deed to their land, you want to keep that yourself because you don't know what'll happen to it when it goes to the courthouse. And another part of history here is in 1871, there was a company formed, William Hillary and Company, after emancipation, and it was William Hillary, Lila Bell, and John Grosvenor, who I'm a direct descendant of. And basically what they did was they formed this company, and they leveraged, their labor, their expertise. They bought over 1,000 acres of land, and then they deeded those lands and those properties back to other families and other descendants, and that's how you ended up with a lot of those communities, especially in the land on the north end in Raccoon Bluff. I say that all to say that there are areas that are still, still disputed. Even though we are surrounded by, what is technically owned by the state, there's still other stories, other significant stories that are big. So.
Jazz touched on this earlier, but in 1934 is when R.J. Reynolds Jr. Created hog hammock as the only place that people could live on the island anymore, when he basically made them move there. And he did that by giving them deeds to their land, because before that they wouldn't have had that. There was electricity in that section of the island where there wasn't electricity anywhere else. He also moved the school, because there was a school at Raccoon.
In the other areas.
In the other areas, but there was a new school here that ran until 1970s. In the 1970s, obviously now all the school children get voted and bused to school on the mainland. But that was when the establishing of it. It's only 4 434 acres, so it's not a very large piece of property. And this map is actually showing you, and I cut off the key, unfortunately, under a picture, but showing you elevation of the island, and obviously the darker blue, the higher it is. So, and the green is marsh. So you can see that that area of the island is not very high.
Well, and then just adding to what Stephanie was saying, just kind of talking about, you know, all the moving parts and the dynamics here, you know, of pushing people into just kind of this, you know, one space of the island. The other thing you have to think about too is, you know, let's say that, you know, you get a person or family is forced to move to, you know, another part of the island. Or let's say you want to fight that. Guess what? You need an attorney. You need a lawyer. So imagine, you know, being back in that time and trying to find, you know, an attorney that will honestly and authentically serve people, you know, who would be fighting against, you know, someone like a Reynolds or someone like a Coffin. I mean, you're literally fighting against the power structure itself. So I just always like to add context in so that people really understand, you know, how contentious it was when it came to, you know, people existing in this space. So, you know, there's a picture of, you know, Lula's Kitchen and, you know, a sign for the community and Allen Bailey and, you know, Martin's Bailey store. And, you know, and when I see this, it is just a strong reminder of the resilience of communities and of people not giving up, you know, still going no matter what. And that again is what helps me to keep going. It makes me understand the sacrifices that came before me and why it's so important, you know, that we fight for places, you know, like Sapelo. It is incumbent upon all of us to think about, you know, what can we do with the power that we have in the spaces that we occupy in order to try to make things right, you know, in order to try to do something to help right a wrong. And I think, you know, and thinking about all this too, you know, I also think about Ahmaud. Ahmaud Arbery was a Sapelo descendant, you know. A few weeks from now, it will be 5 years, you know, since his hunting down and being lynched in broad daylight, you know, and I always think about how strong he was and he had to be. And so it was incumbent upon, you know, not only me, but I worked with my younger cousin Demetrius, and then there were others. There was John Richards, Akeem Baker, Coach Jason Vaughn, and we all worked together to form this thing called I Run With Mom. And it was in the middle of a pandemic. People couldn't even go outside. And yet, we were able to rally, to mobilize, and to be able to create a movement that at least led to some level of accountability, because we saw that the DA was acquitted. Yeah. But again, I think about that, and for me, it goes back to the strength of the people that are the descendants of those Africans who had to find strength in order to be able to survive under these systems that were difficult and that were challenging. And you know, it doesn't mean that they didn't find ways to be happy. They didn't find ways to maintain family because they had to. Because if they didn't, I wouldn't be here. You know, but they did. They somehow found ways to do that. And so I always, you know, lead the charge and call to action when we're doing, you know, this presentation and saying to people, you know, think about what it is that you can do. You know, that can, you know, whether it's supporting Sapelo, whether it's supporting, you know, a community that's near you that is dealing with, you know, whether it's contamination, that is dealing with some type of injustice, that is dealing with, you know, somebody trying to, a city trying to rezone them. You know, what is it that you may not be doing, you know, that you could do? And, and everybody's not meant to, go out and protest and go out and march, and they're not. Everybody's not meant to get up and speak in front of people. But I always say there is always something. You'd be surprised at what an email, a letter, any of that can do, a phone call, to an official, whether it's the public, whether it's local, whether it's state, whether it's federal, and that is power. And that's what I think about when I think about, the resilience, of people like a Miss Lula, like, a Maurice, like in Alan Bailey, who was a kid who grew up on the island and made it to the NFL and has come back home, and started a foundation to, help support the community, so.
Well, besides those current people, we want to highlight some of the members of the community as well. Katie Underwood was a midwife on the island. She was the last midwife that served on Sapelo Island. She delivered lots of babies. There are still some of her babies that are grown adults now living.
Right.
She obviously passed away in 1977, but she was the last midwife, and she would travel all over the island delivering babies. In honor of that, the state did, the boat does not look this fresh and clean anymore, but the ferry that serves the island, that goes back and forth, the main ferry, is named Katie Underwood in her honor.
And I would say one of the honors of the community was, we had the opportunity to be able to name the ferry, after her. And I think it's fitting because this was a woman who walked the entire island. She could go to the north end and check on someone and say, I will be right back, and go deliver a baby on the south end, and just knew when to come back, just in time. I mean, just incredible and amazing stories. And you just think about, there was, no, formal education except for her own education and understanding, what she knew how to do. But the amount of knowledge that she had, in her being and in her bones, to be able, to do all of that is just, it's incredible. But again, I think it lends to the resilience and the brilliance, of people who had little to nothing when it came to resources, right? So, yeah.
Probably one of the most famous women that people know about from Sapelo is Cornelia Bailey, who passed away just a few years ago. She came to fame too. She was always the matriarch, speaking out for the island and its people and trying to make things right. But her book, God, Dr. Buzzard and the Little Man, is probably what shot her to more fame, to communities outside our own here on that.
Yeah, no, Miss Cornelia was just incredible. I treasure so many his days sitting, at her table. She helped to create SICAR, Sapelo Island Cultural and Revitalization Society, her, Yvonne Grover, and a group of other residents. I believe that was in 93. I mean, she was just a, stalwart champion, was not afraid to just tell it like it was, which was even difficult back then, even though people think that, it might have not been so hard. But you gotta imagine, you're still dealing with, these systems, that existed. We're living in a space where, you have a state presence, you have the local presence, and, there are these, internal battles that are going on, but you still have to find ways to coexist in that space. On how do you do that? You just have to learn how to navigate, and she was one of those people that was very significant when it came to the history, of the island. So yeah, it's a great book, and I think we're gonna go to some
Our books
too. Yes. Michelle Nicole Johnson, who was actually at the college here, incredible, wonderful book, Sapelo Island's OHM. And Dr. Melissa Cooper, who was a professor at Rutgers University, Making Gullah. It really goes into like a political landscape at the time on the island. And, both of her parents were descendants. And also to explain, hummock and hammock, hammock is kind of this Americanized iteration, but originally it's called hummock, because a hummock is a raised body of land, so it's always called hummock. That's how the folks pronounce it. So.
Just want to highlight some other things about Sapelo Island. So red peas were originally brought with the enslaved people from Africa, and then were grown here. So there has been an effort to bring more awareness and going back to some cultural roots and coming back. So growing red peas on Sapelo has been a project, and these peas have been sold to restaurants like the Gray, that's right down the road here, to a lot of high restaurants that want to focus more on local indigenous foods.
Yeah, and so the Red Pea Project, I don't remember the exact year, but Ms. Cornelia worked with Dr. Bill Thomas, I think he's in Gainesville, Georgia, and his wife Anita Thomas, and worked with Clemson University, and they brought back these seedlings to kind of reintroduce this, pea project back, and also sugarcane. And so they did all of that while she was really working under the guise of sidecars. Now there is still an agricultural program that's primarily run by one of her children, Maurice Bailey, who runs a organization called Solo, Save Our Legacy Ourselves. And so, and you could probably Google it in cane syrup, so you can buy like Sapelo Beachy syrup. I think that they're going to be growing, indigo, and I guess I'll have peas probably this year. I'm not sure if they had any last year. I do always remember when sitting in my front yard with my, grandmother, like, shelling peas and, I think now when especially just growing up and spending a lot of my summers on Sapelo, like, getting up when like the rooster crowed, I mean, it's like 5 o'clock in the morning, going out into these fields, and I mean, man, I look back now and it was absolutely amazing, right? It just really was. There's just no way to describe, the power of that. And I remember sometimes I would be dragging to get up, but I valued it. When I went to school, my dad was from St. Simon, so that was just completely different. That was like being in the city, St. Simon's. But then there's also a story there. A lot of my dad's ancestors were, business owners, and and I remember when there were significant African American communities on St. Simon's, and he would tell me, look, this place used to be over 90%. African American, but it's not anymore. It's the opposite now. And so, I mean, I think that we have to always keep in mind, that's why it's important to fight for places like Sapelo, like, St. Helena, like, Monteith, which is right here in the city of Port Wentworth, here in Savannah. That's a beachy community. And that's the other thing I want to mention too, is that Gullah Beach communities aren't just on the coast. They are throughout the corridor from North Carolina to Florida. There are beachy communities that are inland too. There could be communities near you. Pinpoint is another community. So just always keeping that in mind.
And the last thing we wanted to highlight was wheatgrass baskets, which originally would have been skills for necessity for carrying goods and storing goods, and now has become such an art form. And so there are wheatgrass baskets, what do you call them? Masters, I want to call them. Out on
Master basket weavers.
Thank you. Master basket weavers out on Sapelo, and using the plants that we have here, purple amelia grass, sawtooth palmetto, pine needles, all these things that are right here along the coast to make now these beautiful baskets that we just sit and don't want to touch. They're so beautiful.
Yeah, and just, and these are, rare artistry that comes out, in Gullah Geechee culture, whether it's basket making, whether it's, I remember when my grandmother would make quilts, she would make grapevine baskets, It's very similar, just, using, grapevines, but doll making, Cornelia's daughter, Terry Bailey, makes like these incredible and amazing dolls. And I think she, learned from my mother and Miss Savannah Bailey and Viola. So there is so much history there. It is so important, and I always tell people it's a part of who I am, but I think this is also something that we all need to protect, and we all should be thinking about.
So this is our last slide, so did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I want to, thank you all for being here. Please take the time to learn more, about, Gullah Geechee culture, the heritage, the communities. Of course, 100 Miles is supporting, the community in our referendum fight. So we formed, this Keep Sapelo Geechee Coalition, which is, 100 Miles, Sapelo Solo, Save Our Legacy Ourselves, SICAR, Sapelo Island Cultural and Revitalization Society, Hoggen Community Foundation, and also Allen Bailey Foundation. So, please, we have keepsapelogeechee.org where you can see information and see updates. The other thing I wanted to mention too was that, after the gangway collapse, we formed a coalition that was really spearheaded and led by Alan and Lauren Bailey with their foundation, Sapelo Strong. And it's all of our organizations mobilized together, and we're working in partnership with the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor to help raise funds. And you can go to sapelostrong.org to find information about that too. But if anything, I just want to encourage you to take the time to, learn more about all these organizations, learn more about the history, the history of the island, and think about ways that you can help, whether it's supporting, the legal fight, whether it's supporting, some of the community organizations. There's always something, whether it's looking at what is going on in Monteith and Port Wentworth and seeing if there's something, that can be done to help them if they're coming into their houses and things of that nature. So there's a lot going on, and even Pinpoint as well. And I want to, and I have a, Russ Parks, I know you're like, don't call my name. But anyway, Russ works with something called Sear Hub, the Coastal Equity and
Resilience. Yes.
And Resilience Hub. And we have been doing great work, together, just working, trying to support and help organizations, because right now we all know that we need each other more than ever right now. And it is so important. It is so important that we're, I think also I want to just say, take care of yourself. That is just so important, because there's so much going on and you can run yourself ragged. And if you're not any good, then, it's just, So you gotta really take care of yourself, make sure that, you're getting rest, because there's a lot of work ahead of us. And I'm just grateful for y'all to be here. I know I'm talking way too much. And Stephanie, just that us doing this together is kind of just this new thing, but I'm glad that we are doing it because I think it's important. So.
Well, we want to thank all of our people for attending. We also want to thank our sponsors. We now have sponsors for Naturalist #1 to help us do these programs for free and get the word out about all of that. For those of you online, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.